Welcome. At least 75 people have been killed in Baghdad as a suicide bomber rammed his explosive-laden truck into a Shia mosque. More than 100 other Iraqis were injured in the bombing, which comes just 2 days after a 4-day curfew was lifted following last week's attack on a revered Shiite shrine. And just hours earlier, US troops launched what the Pentagon called a major offensive to the north of the Iraqi capital. Sebastian Walker reports.
Violence returns to Iraq's capital after days of uneasy calm. The bomb exploded in the very centre of Baghdad. Police say it came from a truck loaded with half a ton of explosives. Again, it was a busy commercial area that was targeted. Again, a mosque was damaged in the blast. Baghdad's only just starting to get back to normal after a 4-day curfew following an attack on one of the country's holiest sites. And this bombing came as around 10,000 US soldiers were embarking on a major military operation north of the capital. The US military released these pictures, saying it's targeting Al-Qaeda fighters who've moved out of the city during the recent security crackdown.
We're going to go after them. They will not have a safe haven here in this country. But we just don't want to push them from one location to another, to go after their networks, their cells, their leaders, to eliminate their opportunity to wage this horrific violence against the people.
But as well as new violence in the capital, there's also been intense fighting in Iraq's south. Clashes there between security forces and Shiite militiamen have left dozens dead over the past 2 days. The huge death toll from the bombing in Baghdad is sure to inflame tensions which many had hoped had calmed over the curfew period. And the US mission to pacify Iraq looks set for some more difficult times ahead. Sebastian Walker, Al Jazeera.
Violence also struck Baghdad's fortified green zone, home to the Iraqi government and American and British embassies. Several mortar rounds were fired into the green zone. Officials say 5 of them struck near the office of the Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. One mortar landed near an American Post Exchange store and another in the garden of the Human Rights Minister's home. It's not clear whether anyone was yet hurt. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and US President George Bush say they're working on a common strategy to fight extremist elements in the Palestinian territories. And after talks in Washington, Prime Minister Olmert and President Bush declared their support for Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas as a moderate voice and the only true leader of the Palestinian people. Both leaders said their countries would help the Palestinian people.
Nobody likes suffering on their border. Nobody likes to see suffering in the world. And so we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about the broader war against extremists and radicals. It's interesting that extremists attack democracies around the Middle East, whether it be the Iraq democracy, the Lebanese democracy, or a potential Palestinian democracy. What that should say clearly to people all around the world is that we are involved with an ideological conflict that is a monumental conflict. And those of us that believe in liberty and human rights and human decency need to be bound together in common cause to fight off these extremists and to defeat them. We can only defeat them so much militarily. We have to also defeat them with a better idea. It's a better idea that's being practiced by our friend Israel. It's called democracy. And that's the fundamental challenge facing this century. Will we have the courage and the resolve necessary to help democracy defeat this ideology? And I will tell the Prime Minister, once again, I'm deeply committed to this cause, whether it be in Iraq or Lebanon or the Palestinian territory or anywhere else in the Middle East.
We have been very, very attentive to the needs of the humanitarian needs of Gaza, and we will continue to provide everything that is necessary in order to meet these humanitarian needs. Israel will not be indifferent to the human suffering in Gaza. Israel will be different from the Palestinians themselves, because the reality is that all this suffering is caused by Palestinians against their own people. What the Hamas was doing in Gaza is absolutely atrocious and intolerable. And I'm sure that many who had some hopes that maybe Hamas can be more reasonable and more restrained, I think now lost these hopes because of what they have been doing to their own people, killing innocent civilians, pulling out from hospital beds Fatah people that were wounded and dropped them off the 5th floor to kill them in the street.
Ehud Olmert speaking there. Well, earlier our Jerusalem correspondent Jackie Rowland gave some insight into the meeting between the two leaders.
There was nothing really surprising in the remarks made by the two leaders, but what I thought was interesting, Mariam, was that in their opening comments, both President Bush and Prime Minister Olmert made a point of describing Mahmoud Abbas as the president of all of the Palestinian people. They reiterated that phrase, and I think that this is really part of their desire to bolster Mr. Abbas. Certainly both of them have said they're going to deal with the new emergency government which has been set up by Mr. Abbas and really seek to isolate what they described extremist elements in Gaza.
Jackie Rowland speaking to us earlier there from Jerusalem. Well, Israeli tanks crossed into the Gaza Strip. Israel says its forces have gone through the Eretz border crossing for a limited time only to prevent an attack. Witnesses said there were bulldozers and several tanks and that gunshots could be heard. On to Africa now, and Darfur, where China is claiming to have persuaded Sudan to accept the deployment of a beefed-up peacekeeping force in the war-torn region. Beijing is also reported to have used a very direct language during meetings with President Omar al-Bashir. But the move to allow UN peacekeepers into Darfur has received a mixed reception on the streets of Khartoum.
The president betrayed us, and our Prophet Muhammad said anyone who would do that is not one of us. President Bashir said they would be mixed forces, but they are not. They are foreign forces who are going to invade all the people in Darfur.
I see the entry of the foreign forces into Sudan as a protection for the Sudanese people. As the whole world knows, Sudan has been suffering from many wars.
In the beginning, I heard President Omar al-Bashir saying that if foreign forces came to Sudan, we would make a jihad against them, and he would lead this jihad. And then today, I heard he accepted them. I think this is just political bargaining.
It is possible that there are certain goals behind the acceptance of foreign forces, and although we should ultimately obey our leaders, this is not preferred by many of our people.
An attempted armed robbery in France has ended with 6 people who were taken hostage released safely. The incident shocked police and residents. 2 men targeted a bank in a secure southern Paris suburb, but police reacted swiftly, arresting the 2 and ending the standoff. A former Serbian police general has appeared at a war crimes tribunal in The Hague to answer charges of crimes against humanity. But Vlastimir Djordjevic declined to make a plea to give him more time to hire a lawyer. He stands accused for the murder and persecution of ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. He's Serbia's former deputy interior minister and security chief and was arrested in Montenegro 2 days ago. They were images that shocked the world. Now, new claims about the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Iraq cast fresh doubts over how much the White House really knew. The US general who first investigated the case says both President Bush and the then Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld learned of the violations long before they became public. John Cookson has the details.
Shocking details of sadistic torture at Iraq's Abu Ghraib prison emerged in April 2004, deeply damaging America's reputation. At the time, President Bush responded with disgust and said he hadn't seen photographs of abuse before they were made public in April. Now renowned journalist Seymour Hersh has revealed the Bush administration, including the then Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, knew long before the story became public, in fact in January, when the whistle was first blown.
They were saying in Baghdad, they were telling Rummy's senior military assistant, a 3-star, now a 4-star general named Craddock, they were telling Wolfowitz's assistant, they were telling the director of the Joint Staff, the key player on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they were saying, man, we got a bad one here, this stinks, here's what's going on. And in one of the early emails, there are 3 or 4 I have from the first week or 2, they described very vividly, in words, the photographs. In other words, as Tagupa said later, Rumsfeld's testimony was, I never saw the pictures until just the other day. I didn't know how bad it was.
But all he had to do was read his secure email and he knew it all.
All he had to do was, you didn't have to see the pictures if you read it.
So far, the White House has pointed the finger of blame over Abu Ghraib at